In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Franklin.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm the Commonwealth Aged Care Regulator was informed of a COVID-19 outbreak at St Basil's Health on 10 July but never told the Department of Health?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and the Minister for Health may wish to add to this answer. But, Mr Speaker, a survey, I'm advised, was conducted by that commission, which, as you know, is an independent agency. In the course of undertaking that survey, that also confirmed, Mr Speaker, that they were aware of the processes they needed to follow to advise regarding any COVID cases in their facilities. Those requirements had been reinforced on several occasions to all operators about the appropriate process for notifying the Commonwealth of COVID cases in their facilities. The Commission did not pass that on to the Commonwealth Department of Health. That was not the process for which COVID cases are advised to the Commonwealth. We were advised by the Public Health Unit in Victoria and then took immediate action.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm very happy to add to the Prime Minister's answer. As he said, on the 10th of July, as part of a survey of facilities right across Victoria, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner's staff were advised that there had been a first case in St Basil's. They were also advised, as part of that, that the Public Health Unit was responsible. The Public Health Unit in Victoria, as per the agreement between the Commonwealth and the state, has principal responsibility for advising, and in addition to that, the facility has responsibility for advising. The subsequent time at which that was advised to the Commonwealth was the 14th of July. More generally, I think it is important to set out some of the actions taken by the Commonwealth in relation to this. Firstly, with regards to testing, as a consequence of that advice on the 14th, Sonic Healthcare conducted on-site testing on the 15th, 19th, 23rd, 24th and 28th of July. Aspen Medical Workforce as clinical first responder on the 16th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 30th of July. Surge Workforce was also activated on 19 July to assist at the service. It was supplied from a number of sources, including Northern Health, and personal protective equipment was supplied from the National Medical Stockpile on the 15th, 16th, 23rd, 24th, 25th and 30th of July.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Well, the Prime Minister outlined to the House the importance of the Morrison government's plans to grow our economy while protecting Australia from the health effects of the coronavirus.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the member knows, despite the impact of COVID-19 on Australia, which has been significant, Australia has fared better than most of the developed countries in the world, not just on a health basis but also on an economic basis. And that has been because of the efforts of Australians and the efforts of so many around this country to achieve those outcomes, but has been principally based around getting the balance right between the health and the economic issues to ensure that we have always been seeking to save lives and to save livelihoods and get an appropriate assessment of mitigating the risk on both of those in balance to ensure we minimise the impact on Australia. And the suppression strategy that has been this country's strategy, endorsed by National Cabinet and by our own Cabinet, Mr Speaker, from the outset of this outbreak, gets that balance between the two, understanding we need to live with the virus and we need to contain community transmission and ensure that we continue to live in an open society with our economy as open as possible, Mr Speaker. Now, Australians understood the necessity of the measures that were taken throughout March and April because they understood that at the early stages of this outbreak we needed to get in place the protections and the supports that were needed to protect against community transmission of the virus in the future. And they are also supported with the single largest income support package delivered by a federal government in Australia's history, and that was understood. And that's a suppression strategy. It was based on getting international borders and quarantine arrangements in place to ensure that we were boosting health system preparedness with PPE, with respirators, with testing kits and all the other things that were necessary, Mr Speaker, to ensure that should an outbreak of the scale we were seeing, and particularly in Europe at that time, hit Australia, then our system would be able to deal with it. And those protections were put in place across our health system with the strong support and cooperation of the states and the territories. Testing and tracing regimes were put in place, and Australia was leading the world on testing capabilities during those phases, Mr Speaker, and we still retain a very high level of testings. Our industrial tracing, particularly in the area in New South Wales, has been an absolute saviour, Mr Speaker. COVID-safe behaviour right across the community with social distancing and in workplaces and containing hotspots. That's the suppression strategy. But, Mr Speaker, where those things have failed, as they have in Victoria, then we have seen significant community outbreak and the most extensive restrictions that any Australian has ever had to live in this country, including during wartime, Mr Speaker, and that is of great regret. Our goal should be to reopen Australia again, Mr Speaker, to reopen Australia right across the country to live with this virus.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Is it correct the Prime Minister waited until the first death of an aged care resident in Victoria to make masks mandatory for Victorian aged care workers?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Commonwealth has always followed the medical advice regarding the wearing of masks, whether in aged care facilities or in any other places.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister please inform the House how the McCormack-Morrison government is supporting regional Australia through COVID-19 pandemic? The impact of the restrictions placed on regional communities, particularly in Victoria and in Queensland.
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for Flynn for his question. I know the issue of domestic borders is very important to him, Mr Speaker, and to many others in this place who are seeing their regional communities grapple with these restrictions. Mr Speaker, indeed, our aviation sector, for them, for all of those employed in that sector, state border closures are very much holding back recovery. And I note the announcement by Qantas just before question time, Mr Speaker, about further job losses. I empathise with those people who are now finding themselves out of work. We have put in place support measures for those people, and we will continue to support the sector very much so, Mr Speaker. And when there are issues in Melbourne, local communities in and around Mildura or Bairnsdale shouldn't have to cop the consequences, Mr Speaker. They should not. Swan Hill is not Swanston Street. When there is a spike in Brisbane, is it fair for businesses in Blackwater or Biloela to face restrictions to their trade? I would argue it is not. Imposing stage 4 lockdown in a hotspot such as Melbourne is imperative to the containment of the virus. No one disputes that. We all know that. But, however, imposing stage 3 restrictions on a blanket basis is, I would argue, unjustifiable. I think we can all agree you do not fix a health issue in Melbourne by creating an economic downturn in Mildura. Due to stage 4 restrictions in Melbourne, where daily COVID-19 cases reached as high as 730, and that is very, very sad, we acknowledge that, all of regional Victoria was placed on stage 3 restrictions. These non-targeted restrictions are crippling country communities
Members on my left,
and regional small businesses, particularly in hospitality and tourism. Many rural communities have not had a COVID case in months, many not at all. Yet every business in regional Victoria is hurting because of the cluster-based outbreaks of the virus. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't stack up. One city, one state, but affecting all of the nation, particularly hurting regional Victoria, regional Australia in general. Just last week we had the ridiculous situation where Chris Taylor, a farmer from Warwick-Nabeal in Victoria, wanted to take a load of hay to his 1,500 sheep in Euston, just 240 kilometres away across the border in New South Wales. The flock needs crutching and needs attention right now. However, Chris says he was told he would have to truck the 43 tonnes of hay to Melbourne, 340 kilometres away, and then fly it to Sydney, 880 kilometres, then isolate in Sydney for a fortnight, and then truck the hay to his sheep in Euston, 930 kilometres away. I mean, this is just ridiculous. So I'm calling on the states to act practically, to act pragmatically, to act with some common sense. This is the type of action that colleagues have now been advocating for many weeks.
Members on my left.
The members for Marinara, the member for Flynn, and particularly the member for Mallee.
Kingston
And I
Smith
know
is warned.
we have long urged the states to provide the common sense action our communities in regional Australia are relying on and need right now.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again addressed to the Prime Minister. And I ask, is it true that the government undertook no audit of aged care providers to ensure they had adequate stocks of PPE despite more than 1,300 requests for access to the National Medical Stockpile by May?
The Minister for Health.
No, that's not the advice that I have. The advice is that we've had multiple engagements with aged care providers, all aged care providers around the country, in COVID preparation. There have been 6 stages to this national plan in relation to the aged care facilities. Firstly, beginning in January with the appropriate advice to all facilities at a time before even the borders were closed, at a time before even the first border was closed. But we also closed the borders to China for a reason, to protect those in aged care facilities. The Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission has been in contact and surveyed all aged care facilities in Australia, not just once, but more than one occasion, and indeed multiple occasions. That's a very important element. And in terms of masks and PPE, we have provided facilities across Australia with over 12 million masks and PPE. The advice that I have is where there are requests, they are acted upon quickly and expeditiously. The second of the stages, of course, was in February, where the Australian Pandemic Response Plan was released, and that includes a very strong focus on aged care. And then on the 13th of March, Stage 3, the CDNA plan for all of Australia, the Aged Care National Response Plan, was released, again, which went through in extensive detail the PPE. Throughout that time, there have been multiple engagements with the National Medical Survey. No, all facilities in Australia have been contacted through the course of the pandemic by the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission in order to ensure their preparedness. The 4th phase was the provision of workforce support, and then the 5th and 6th phases were the updating of the national plan off the basis of international experience and domestic experience. So all of those have occurred, including 12 million masks right across the country to aged care facilities, of which almost 10 million have gone specifically to Victoria. That's included the mandating of masks in Victoria, and it's included the offer and the ability to provide services where they are required around the country.
It's now the independence question, and I'm going to call the Leader of the Greens and member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Warnings from Australia's top climate scientists today reinforce the danger of a gas-led COVID recovery, because the leaking of methane from gas production and pipelines has destroyed the gas cartel's claim that gas is cleaner than coal. There's now widespread opposition to your gas plan, including from the former Premier of New South Wales, Bob Carr, who says that, quote, if gas leaks at more than a rate of 3%, it's worse than coal. Prime Minister, do you agree with Bob Carr, and isn't your plan for a so-called gas-led COVID recovery now in tatters?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I know who does like our gas plan, the member for Hunter, Mr Speaker. He likes our gas plan. Maybe he's got a few friends who like our gas plan over there, and I suspect, Mr Speaker, there are a few others who have a different view on the opposition benches, what they feel about gas.
Member for Sydney and the Treasurer.
Gas, Mr Speaker, is a bit confusing. Mr Speaker, what we know is this. What we know is this, is gas is the important transition fuel for the changes in our energy needs for this country for the future. because it does two things, Mr Speaker. The gas that we need, Mr Speaker, for Australian jobs, for Australian industry, is also the same gas which firms the renewable technologies that we're putting in our energy sector at record levels that enables the transition, Mr Speaker. And that is why we want to see more of it. We want to get more of it out of the ground, Mr Speaker, so we can fuel the jobs that this country needs as we come out of the COVID-19 recession. Now, Mr Speaker, I can hear many interjections from the Labor side. I don't know if they're interjecting against each other on gas or against me, Mr Speaker, such as their confusion when it comes to gas. I suppose they can go down to the Otis restaurant and get together. Another will get into another restaurant at another place, Mr Speaker, and to try and decide what their position on gas is, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, this government knows that gas is necessary to fuel the recovery that this country will need coming out of the COVID-19 recession. We all support it, Mr Speaker. We're all behind it, Mr Speaker, and I believe the Australian people will also.
The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House the rapid and extensive support the Morrison government is providing to Victorian families and businesses after the COVID-19 pandemic broke out again in the great state of Victoria?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Goldstein for his question and congratulate him on his new book, which, as I understand it, is available at all good bookstores across the country, Mr Speaker, and also on his strong support for his electorate. Now, Mr Speaker, more than 6.5
Members
million
on my left.
Victorians are doing it very tough. There are Victorians right now who are subject to curfews, Victorians who have seen businesses close, Victorians have seen schools close. Mr Speaker, people can't go to work in Victoria. In Victoria, parents and grandparents, Mr Speaker, are finding it very tough and kids are not seeing their friends. This is the heavy price being paid by Victorians for the second wave of COVID-19. And there's a huge economic cost as well. It's Treasury's forecast that up to 400,000 Victorians will either lose their job or see their hours reduced to zero. That's the equivalent of 4 MCGs full of people on grand final day. 400,000 Victorians who are effectively unemployed as a result of this second wave, Mr Speaker. Now, the Morrison government is standing with Victorians every step of the way. Already more than $12 billion has made its way to Victorians through JobKeeper. Around $6 billion has made its way to Victorian businesses with the cash flow boost. And more than $2 billion has gone to Victorian pensioners and others on income support with the two $750 payments. And 575,000 Victorians are currently receiving the $550 coronavirus supplement, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, Victorians look at New South Wales and they ask, why not us? They look at New South Wales with lower number of cases and a lower number of deaths. And they look at the fact that in New South Wales there has been 315,000 jobs created in recent months. Now, I understand why Victorians are now very concerned by the Victorian government announcing yesterday that it wants to extend the emergency powers for another 12 months. I share those concerns, Mr Speaker, and the Victorian government has to explain its decision. Now, Mr Speaker, the Victorian government and the Australian government under Scott Morrison will work together to support Victorians, Mr Speaker, but at the end of the day, we will do everything to support Victorians get to the other side of this crisis, but the Victorian government has a lot of questions to answer.
Members on my left, the member for Barton, members on both sides, the member for Gorton. We've got some new faces here today. I just asked them to reflect on the remarks I made yesterday. I'm not going to be tolerant of interjections during this sitting for a whole range of reasons, and I've made that very clear. So you've all travelled distances to be here, and I appreciate there's a bit of a roster with people coming in and out, but you'll certainly be out the door if you keep interjecting. I'm now going to call the member for Fraser.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. At the Kalinia Care aged care facility 6 minutes down the road from where I am now, a 95-year-old woman had ants crawling from her open wounds. Staff shortages during a COVID outbreak at the home meant she did not receive the care she needed. She later died. Why didn't the Prime Minister have a plan to stop tragedies like this?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the Kalinia Care Centre that the member refers to was one of those 4 centres that I referred to in my remarks yesterday, where those outcomes were simply not acceptable. They are 4 centres out of over 2,700 aged care centres in Australia, and 4 of those have had these absolutely outrageous and unacceptable outcomes. And I've offered my apologies on those already. But I would simply note this, that whether in that facility or the other 3 where there have been the most significant of these outcomes, in 97% of the cases in all other aged care facilities in Australia, we have seen no COVID in any of those centres. And I would add this, that in Australia, 8% of our facilities, 8% have had COVID infections involving both residents and staff. In the United Kingdom, that figure is 56%, 7 times worse. Now, what has happened at Kalinia and St Basil's and Epping Gardens, Mr Speaker, and others, is totally unacceptable. But in a global pandemic and where community transmission reached what it did in Victoria, Mr Speaker, the fact that in Australia it has been contained despite these terrible tragedies, and that it has occurred in other countries like Australia, in the United Kingdom, at 7 times the level that we've seen here in Australia, that demonstrates that the plan we put in place, Mr Speaker, has had an impact, and it has had a positive impact. Mr Speaker, the events that the member refers to are shocking, they're disturbing, they're upsetting. They were to me at the time when it was relayed to me, and as we were working night and day at that time to restore stability into that facility and the 3 others that were most critically affected. But in so many other cases, what I'm pleased at least to say is that those 4 cases did not become 100. Those 4 cases did not become 1,000, because that is what was seen in the United Kingdom. And so we will continue to implement the plan. And while there can never be any absolute guarantees, particularly in a 1 in 100-year pandemic, we will do everything we can to ensure that what occurred at Kalinia doesn't happen in other facilities.
And I call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting the mental health and well-being of Australians during the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Robertson and all members of this House who are deeply aware of the mental health impacts on top of the health and economic impacts of this pandemic on Australians. Whether it's in New South Wales or South Australia or Queensland, whether it's in any state or territory, but most particularly now in Victoria, given that we have a state in a circumstance with curfews, with families being locked down for effectively 23 hours in a day, in many cases single parents with small children in small flats, where we have businesses that are closed forcibly, where we have the mandatory wearing of masks, where we have a 5-kilometre movement limit, restrictions on people's liberties and lifestyles that are beyond any comprehension that any of us could have imagined for a free democratic society like Australia. Given all of those elements, we've taken 3 significant steps nationally as part of our pandemic mental health plan and 3 significant steps for Victoria. Recognising that, we instituted telehealth as a fundamental reform, a 10-year plan delivered in 10 days. And as part of that, there are now over 26.5 million services, a vast number of which have been for mental health. In particular, specific mental health items. What we've seen is that 35% of all mental health items since the 16th of March and since the expansion on the 30th of March have been delivered over telehealth. That's part of a $1.1 billion package. We've delivered support services. In particular, we announced $74 million with a focus on Beyond Blue, Lifeline, Kids Help, Headspace and digital help. The Pandemic Response Plan, which included $48 million and a further $20 million for research, with a particular focus of $19 million for older Australians, building on the $87 million we had for those older Australians with mental health challenges in residential care. And in Victoria, where these restrictions, beyond what any of us could ever have imagined in this country, on our watch, in our time, are in place right now, and yesterday's news has been confronting for so many Victorians in terms of the 12-month extension. Better access. We've doubled the Better Access plan. Youth support, $12 million for service surge capacity to Victorians, including $5 million for Headspace, with a particular focus on years 11 and 12, and 15 mental health clinics, 9 in metropolitan areas and 6 in rural areas. These are actions on top of what we do with health to help save lives and protect lives, and I hope command the support of every member of this House.
And I call the member for Scullin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's for the Prime Minister. Epping Gardens in my electorate is the site of Australia's worst aged care coronavirus outbreak. More than 20 residents have died. At the height of the outbreak, just 6 rostered staff were available to care for 115 residents, many of them already ill with COVID. Why didn't the Prime Minister have a plan to stop tragedies like this?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Epping Gardens was one of the other facilities of the 4 that I've already mentioned before in my earlier answers to this House. And, as was the case at Epping Gardens and other places, once being advised of the situation in Epping Gardens, the officials and health officers and others moved very quickly to restore workforce and to provide whatever supports were necessary right across that facility, conducting the testing, conducting the transfers to private and other hospitals that was facilitated by the health agreement, private health agreement put in place by the Minister for Health with private hospitals right across the country to ensure that the people that were affected by these terrible events at Epping Gardens and the other facilities that I've nominated, that in those cases that we were able to stabilise the facility as soon as could be practically achieved. Mr Speaker, these events that have occurred in these 4 centres in particular, that have occurred in Victoria, are terrible outcomes, as I've already mentioned, and we deeply regret the terrible events that have occurred to those individuals. What it reminds us of is that in the vast majority of cases that the plans that have been put in place have been effective, but in specific cases, that is the day when the virus has got the better of those centres and the arrangements around those. And the reason for that is, Mr Speaker, the level of community transmission that has occurred in Victoria cannot be underestimated. Mr Speaker, the reason we haven't seen the level of distress in those facilities in 7 other states and territories is because we have not seen the community outbreak in those states and territories. As I just mentioned in my answer to the last question, in other countries where have we seen these outbreaks, in the United Kingdom, we have seen 7 times the impact in aged care facilities there as compared to Australia. Those 4 cases, Mr Speaker, it is our deep regret, as I'm sure it is of everyone who has been involved in working to try and support those facilities. But the plan we put in place, Mr Speaker, enabled us to stabilise that facility as quickly as possible, and that facility was ultimately stabilised and residents were fully transferred out of those centres, Mr Speaker. So the government will continue to apply this plan. As we said, the number of critical facilities has been reduced from 13 to 3 as a result of putting those plans in action in those circumstances, and we will continue to do that. But for those who are impacted, and particularly the families of residents as well, the communication support that was put in by Services Australia to ensure that we were reaching all of those families and providing outward calls, that was part of the plan, and that was put in place to deal with the most extreme of circumstances. And I want to thank all of the staff who turned up to work, who were able to source and get into that facility, the Defence Force personnel that went into the facility to make that situation as stabilised as we possibly could under the circumstances.
And I call the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government is supporting students during this difficult time, including through the provision of mental health support?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Boothby for her question. And I know I speak for all members in this House when I say to all students, we understand the difficulties that you'll face this year, and in particular Year 12 students, the challenges that you're facing. This year has looked like no other for you. The idea of going to formals, looking forward to schoolies, having the uncertainty as to when your exams might be, earlier in the year not knowing whether there might be mass repeating, not understanding whether there might be a Year 13 that you would have to undertake. These have been incredibly trying times for you. And in Victoria in particular, where the students haven't had that face-to-face contact with teachers and been able to go to school, it's been extraordinarily difficult. And there's been things that have been happening where they've had to ask questions, where they've had to seek help. And I know parents right across the board have been working with their students to make sure that they understand what is happening. I had a call from a student yesterday when the state of emergency was extended for 12 months, saying, what does this mean to me? Does this mean that I might not be able to get back to school for another year, and having to allay those types of fears? So, Mr Speaker, what the government has done is put in a range of measures to help and support students. The Health Minister, with Beyond Blue, has worked with the Department of Education to put in place BU, the National Education Initiative, which provides teachers and students with help and support. This includes information to help early learning communities look after children's and their own mental health. There's been a 70% uptake by schools of this resource, and I say to all those other schools, please look at this very important resource. The Australian Government has a student wellbeing hub at studentwellbeinghub.edu.au, and that has a range of measures there to help students deal with COVID-19. And there is also hope for students. There is also hope for students. As the Treasurer said yesterday, 150,000 jobs have been created recently for young people, so there will be employment opportunities there. We are also providing extra places in vocational education, which will be really important as well, and in higher education. So the employment, the vocational education opportunities and the higher education opportunities will be there for you when you finish this year.
The Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Jellybrand.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is for the Prime Minister. More than 50 COVID-19 cases have been linked to the Dudagala Aged Care Centre in Yarraville in my electorate. Sandra, whose father Wilhelm was a resident who died in the outbreak, responded to the Prime Minister's claim of a plan by asking, what was this plan? And if there was a plan, it was not implemented properly, or maybe it was the wrong plan. Why wasn't there a plan to keep Sandra's father and others like him safe from COVID-19?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And again, we acknowledge the very significant and severe impacts at, in this case, Dudagala at Yarraville Village. And, Mr Speaker, the village notified the Department of Health of one positive staff member having contracted COVID on the 31st of July of this year. The Department of Health organised tailored support as soon as this notification occurred. The Department of Health also immediately organised for the testing of all residents and staff at the Dudakala Yarrawalla village, and this was conducted on the 1st of August. The clinical first responder nurse attended on the 4th of August of 2020. The Australian Government provided surge staff from the 6th of August and continues to do so. This is in addition to the assistance of the Victorian DHHS through the Western Health Service, who have been critical supports from those health services into these aged care facilities as part of our partnership arrangement with the Victorian Government. The service has also been provided with specialist infection control support through the deployment of ASMAT teams. The Australian Government has also ensured families remain engaged and arranged for the Older Persons Advocacy Network to provide support to families and residents throughout the outbreak. However, approved providers of residential aged care facilities like Dudakala Aged Care, they have a responsibility to their residents and families and residents to ensure that quality care continues to be provided. The Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission is working to actively ensure that providers' obligations are met, and all impacted aged care services in Victoria, including at Dudakala Yarrawalla Village, are receiving assistance from the government, including a case manager, PPE, testing support and workforce support. Now, those facts, I'm sure, even though they would be welcome, I know will not console those who have lost loved ones and been impacted by these terrible events. And that's why the government has offered our condolences and our apologies where these instances have occurred. But I stress again, Mr Speaker, this is a terrible pandemic. This has been a terrible outbreak of the virus in Victoria. We cannot ignore that fact in this place. We cannot pretend that these events would not have occurred other for the community outbreak that occurred in Melbourne and in Victoria. That is why, as the Minister for Health was saying earlier, the way to avoid all of this ultimately is ensure that we make the outbreak containment measures, the protection around quarantine, the testing and tracing, all of which, Mr Speaker, have been brought into question here that has led to the community outbreak in Victoria. And that ultimately ends with terrible circumstances like those you've described.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister update the House on the state of the global coronavirus pandemic and how Australia's COVID-19 strategy compares internationally?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Moncrieff, who has focused very strongly on maintaining healthcare and the activities within her electorate and supporting her electorate members during the course of the pandemic. Globally now, this pandemic has reached over 23.5 million people. Sadly, over 811,000 lives have been lost. In Australia now, 25,053 cases have been formally diagnosed and 525 lives have been lost. Today, there were 151 cases, one in hotel quarantine, 6 states and territories with 0, 1 state, New South Wales, with 2 cases in the community, and 1 state with 148. That's Victoria. That reflects the trend that we have seen since the 1st of June. On the 1st of June, there were 7,370 cases in Victoria. That has grown to over 25,000 cases now, or an increase of 17,683 cases. I say that because 16,811, or 95% of the increase in Australian cases since the 1st of June, have come from one state, overwhelmingly from one city and overwhelmingly from one part of one city. 99% of lives lost since the 1st of June have all been lost in Victoria. So this is very much, sadly and tragically, the issue of one city in one state above all else.
Member for Chifley.
In particular, what we have seen in Victoria—
You should withdraw, Mr Speaker.
No, the member for Chifley will cease interjecting or he won't be here. The minister has the call.
What we have seen is 1,000% growth in cases in one state. No other state has had more than 25% over the course of the last 3 months. But what we have done as a country, and when we look around the world at those figures, is we have seen a containment strategy based on borders with 94,000 people that have been through the hotel quarantine program and 2,269 positive cases detected and prevented from escaping into the community through that hotel quarantine program. 7 out of 8 states and territories, it has worked remarkably well. We know the tragic consequences in one. Testing, 5.8 million tests, one of the world's leading testing programs, according to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Tracing, 7 out of 8 states and territories have had an extraordinary response, and the difference between Victoria and New South Wales has been the Public Health Unit's tracing program. It has prevented an outbreak on a catastrophic scale, and distancing is what has also been used to protect. All these things have come together to protect Australia. Where 2 of those elements have not been in place, sadly we have seen tragedies in Victoria.
The member for Franklin.
So my question is to the Prime Minister. Is it correct, as the Aged Care Royal Commission heard, that Australia has, and I quote, one of the highest rates in the world of residential aged care deaths as a proportion of deaths from COVID-19?
The Prime Minister.
I'll ask the Minister for Health to also add to this answer. Mr Speaker, what we know is because that Australia has been so successful, Mr Speaker, in ensuring that fatalities resulting from COVID-19 more broadly across the population, then clearly those in residential aged care facilities, which is the most vulnerable, is going to have a higher proportion. And the only figure I need to point to you to demonstrate that is in New Zealand that rate is even higher at over 70%, Mr Speaker, and I don't think anyone in this House would be suggesting that in New Zealand, as opposed to Australia, they have had a worse experience or they have had a less prepared arrangement than we have here in Australia. So if the member opposite wants to make that allegation, we've made this point very clear to the Royal Commission. The evidence provided by the Secretary of Health was very clear that that was a use of statistics which was highly misleading, Mr Speaker, and for the member to repeat it here in this place, I don't think reflects well on our understanding of these issues, but I'll ask the Minister for Health to add.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm very happy to add to the answer from the Prime Minister. The international data comparison, which has built on what was provided to the Royal Commission, the percentage of lives lost amongst those in residential aged care, one life lost would have been a tragedy in any country. In Australia, it is sadly 0.18%. In Canada, it is 1.5% or over 6 times higher, or 600% of the Australian figure. In France, it is 2.4% or over 1,300% of the Australian figure. In Spain, it is 2.5% or just over 1,300% of the Australian figure. In Ireland, it is 3.2% or 1,600% of the Australian figure. In Italy, it is 3.2% or 1,600% of the Australian figure. In Austria, it is 4.9% of all aged care residents who have passed away, or approximately 2,800% of the Australian figure. And in the United Kingdom, it is 16,598 residents that have passed away, approximately 5.3% of all residents in aged care facilities, or approximately 3,000% of the Australian figure.
I now call. I'm now going to call the member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister outline to the House how the National Coordination Mechanism has been helping to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic by working with states and territories to resolve logistical issues and keep Australians healthy and safe?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Groom very much for his question. Mr Speaker, as all Australians recall, when the federal government responded in March, not only did we provide significant support to families and small businesses to help them through this terrible time, but we also did a significant amount of work to help our supermarkets remain stocked and to make sure that produce and products, whether they were produced domestically or imported, were able to travel around the country. and we stood up on the 5th of March the National Coordination Mechanism, which was a task force brought together within the Department of Home Affairs, and I want to commend the work in particular of the Deputy Commissioner, Secretary of my department, Paul Grigson, and all of those that work with him, who have really gone above and beyond to work with their state counterparts, to work on these issues where there needed to be a coordination between the states, territories and the Commonwealth to make sure that we could deal with issues as they arose on a daily basis. And in many of those meetings where I was able to chair with the CEOs of the supermarkets, we were able to deal with issues, particularly where particular product lines were out of stock and there was panic within some parts of the Australian community. We were able to resolve those issues as quickly as possible. And, Mr Speaker, obviously that work continued, and there were referrals made by the National Cabinet to the NCM to make sure that they could work through those issues. And it is true that most of those issues were resolved. We were able to work with the states and territories, and my assumption was that we were able to move beyond the necessity for that NCM to continue its work. But it's been obvious, Mr Speaker, that with the events in Victoria, we've had to make sure that the NCM works very closely to address the issues that have arisen in Victoria. Obviously, we don't have those concerns in New South Wales or WA or the Northern Territory or Queensland, etc. But we have had significant problems to address, and assistance that has been required by Victoria to help coordinate again the movement of freight, in particular between Victoria and New South Wales, across that border, and to do so in a COVID-safe way. I want to make sure that we send a very clear message to all Australians, and that is that we will continue to do whatever we can, particularly from the Home Affairs portfolio, to keep Australians safe. Obviously, the Home Affairs portfolio and department plays a very key part in facilitating trade into and out of Australia and to supporting those states and territories through the pandemic, but in particular at the moment with what has happened in Victoria, with the problems around hotel quarantining and the failings in Victoria or otherwise, we've been able to step up with the NCM, and I really commend all of those officers that have been involved in helping bring the task force together to resolve issues as they arise.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister, and I ask, why has the Prime Minister yesterday and again today continued to spin that 97% of aged care facilities don't have an outbreak of COVID-19 when this has resulted in more than 300 aged care residents losing their life, 10 aged care homes in Victoria experiencing more than 100 cases, and more than 1,100 aged care residents battling COVID-19 as we meet here in this parliament today?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, all of the facts that the Leader of the Opposition has just referred to, and particularly in relation to the terrible fact of the 335 deaths in residential aged care, the 7 who were home care recipients, Mr Speaker, the government has acknowledged all of these. But it is also true, Mr Speaker, that in 97% of cases of the more than 2,700 aged care facilities in this country, that there have been no COVID infections. And it is also true that when you combine together those facilities in Australia that have had staff infections as well as resident infections, that is 8% in Australia, and in the UK it is 56%, which is 7 times worse, Mr Speaker. I mean, I'm happy for facts to be brought before this place, Mr Speaker, but it would seem that the Leader of the Opposition is not happy for this fact to also be understood. And the fact is, Mr Speaker, that while COVID has taken a terrible toll on the lives of 335 Australians in residential aged care and 7 home care recipients, Mr Speaker, the plan that we put in place, the arrangements that we have been able to deliver on the ground, the work that we have been able to do in partnership with state and territory governments, Mr Speaker, has saved lives and it has saved livelihoods. And the figures that were just cited by the Minister for Health, comparing Australia's outcome to those overseas, Mr Speaker, I think is important encouragement and hope for Australians that demonstrates that here in this country, despite the terrible toll for those who have suffered, that were it not for the way that Australia has dealt with this together, Mr Speaker, we would have been seeing far worse situations. Now, it is true that in Victoria we are seeing the worst of it when the protective measures that were put in place and built up as part of that national strategy, employed by all states and territories, have failed in Victoria. That is true, Mr Speaker, that the testing and the tracing and the quarantine arrangements have proven to be unacceptable and led to what we've seen with community outbreak in Victoria. And that has resulted in the most heavy restrictions that we've ever seen. And we want to see those restrictions come off, and we're doing everything we can to help Victoria right the situation and stabilise the situation so it can be opened up again, Mr Speaker. But these restrictions that we're seeing across our country, these must be the last resort, not the first resort. The testing, the tracing, the quarantine, the COVID-safe measures, the outbreak containment, that is what enables Australia to live alongside this virus without destroying livelihoods, Mr Speaker, as we are seeing in New South Wales right now, Mr Speaker, where that state has faced equal and, I'd argue, even more risks, Mr Speaker, even more risks than we've seen in all other states and territories, but their system has withstood, and that means they can keep businesses open, they can save lives.
And I call the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the minister please outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is backing Australia's agricultural workforce to help support our regional communities, especially in Victoria, through the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Agriculture has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for Mallee, not just for her question, but for her passionate representation of her electorate and regional Victoria, from the hard borders that have been imposed on regional Victorians, and she has been ably supported by Senator McKenzie, the member for Nichols, the member for Gippsland, and also Senator Davies, in bringing this to the national attention, the impacts this is having on agricultural production systems and supply chains, but also human health. There's been tragic stories that the member for Mallee has passionately brought forward that has then seen leadership from states in working with the federal government to be able to rectify in a compassionate way, and I thank her and her colleagues for their representation. But it is important to understand that our agricultural production systems are integrated, particularly on the East Coast, and workforce plays an integral part in that. And that's why we're continuing to work with states to understand that city-centric solutions don't necessarily cut it in regional and rural Australia, in making sure that we can retrofit some of the restrictions that have been put in place to understand the nuances that are needed to keep our supply chains moving, to make sure the food and fibre remains on the shelves every time we go to the shops. And that's why we'll continue to work with the states in practical solutions in achieving that. And I have to say that the Chief Medical Officer in Queensland has in fact shown some leadership on that. And I challenged all the Chief Medical Officers to go out and to listen and to understand regional communities, understand the needs of the agricultural production systems, and to listen to local leaders. And she listened to the local mayor in Gundawindi, Lawrence Springborg, and understood and opened up the borders between Queensland and New South Wales to allow farmers who have properties on both sides of the border to be able to go across and to tend to their crops, but also, importantly, for animal welfare. You see, regional and rural Australia have evolved past lines on a map that were put in place over 100 years ago. A modern-day regional Australia is fully integrated, and it needs to be supported with practical, common-sense solutions. And I congratulate the Queensland Chief Medical Officer for that understanding. And we're now working, and I understand the South Australian government's making some announcements today in terms of loosening their restrictions in a practical, common-sense way that keeps us safe. That's what this is about, is keeping us safe, but using practical solutions that keep the country moving. That's an important step in understanding what we do. And this is going to hit a real peak, particularly as we get towards the end of the year.
Member for
as
Bruce
we get into warmer months,
Solomon.
the demand on seasonal workers will be even greater, and the government worked in March to extend the term of those in the Pacific and seasonal visa holders to be able to go for another 12 months if they worked in agriculture, a critical industry. And we've put in place a pilot in the Northern Territory, 177 mango pickers came in and been able to support that industry in a practical way. This is about practical solutions, making sure those jobs are market tested where Australians get first crack at them, but where they can't, we need support. We'll give practical solutions to support Australian farmers to put their food and fibre on your shopping shelves.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his decision to remove Aged Care Minister Richard Colbeck from decisions to activate new aged care emergency measures. Isn't this a declaration of no confidence in the capacity of Minister Colbeck to do his day job? And if that's the case, why is this minister still there?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, the member's question only indicates his lack of understanding about how advice from the AHPPC
Members
is dealt
on both
with by the
sides.
Minister for Health. Now, Mr Speaker, the report today, I note, and I'll ask the Minister for Health to add further to the answer, does not reflect, Mr Speaker, how those processes are normally handled, and they have been handled in the way they always are. The Minister for Aged Care, I speak to, Mr Speaker, every single day. He is part of the hookup that we have with the Deputy Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Health Minister and myself, in particular reviewing the aged care issues on a daily basis that we have been doing for some time. The Minister for Aged Care is regularly providing briefings to the Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet, as more than $1 billion,
Member for Rankin,
Mr Speaker, has been added to our COVID support in aged care, and in addition to that, in providing briefings to the National Security Committee of Cabinet, where those matters have been relevant to his portfolio, Mr Speaker. The Minister for Aged Care over these many months has been responsible for the outcomes that I've referred to earlier, Mr Speaker, which has seen Australia be in a position where 97% of facilities in this country, despite the significant community outbreak in Victoria, which the Leader of the Opposition has a blind spot on. The Leader of the Opposition believes that in Victoria there's nothing going on when it comes to community transmission. There has been no failure of quarantine. There has been no failing of tracing, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition seems to think that everything is okay in Victoria and there have only been challenges in aged care. The Leader of the Opposition has a blind spot on Victoria, Mr Speaker. What we are doing is addressing the challenges that has resulted from the outbreak in community transmission in
member
Victoria,
for McMahon is now
and the
warned.
Minister for Aged Care has been acquitting his responsibilities in those areas, but the Minister for Health may wish to add further.
The Minister for Health is just adding to the answer. I'll come to the next question. When he's concluded, the Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm pleased to add to the Prime Minister's answer. And the very simple response is that what was done was a matter of course. The AHPPC, which was reporting through the Chief Medical Officer to the Secretary of Health, who reports to the Minister for Health, used an ordinary procedure, that is the ordinary case event. More broadly, though, what we have seen is 4 key pillars established as part of this response. 1, a public hospitals agreement. 2, a private hospitals agreement. 3, a surge workforce approach. And 4, a testing approach for every facility in Australia that needs it. All of those 4 pillars were critically developed in conjunction with and in many cases with the leadership of
the member for Braddon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the Attorney please update the House on how the Morrison government's temporary industrial relations flexibility will support businesses to get through the COVID-19 pandemic and grow jobs on the other side?
The Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question and his interest in this area. And of course, in April of this year, our government made it possible for employers to give what were called JobKeeper enabling directions, and the purpose of those directions was simply put to save jobs. They could be directions on hours, on duties, of locations of work, and they were all based on need. And so linking the flexibilities to need provided the reason, but also the great safeguard for those flexibilities. So, for instance, an employee's hours would only be able to be reduced if the employee cannot be usefully employed for the employee's normal days or hours because of changes linked to COVID-19. Now, in the 6-month period that JobKeeper number 1 was active and is active, somewhere up to potentially 3.5 million employees would have potentially fallen under the subject of that new IR flexibility. Now, common sense tells us, I think, that those flexibilities would have saved hundreds of thousands of jobs, because the worst possible thing that you can do to a struggling business is to force it to pay for staff to do work that doesn't exist because of COVID-19. And if you look at what has happened, restaurants, cafes who would have had their turnover totally collapsed, who might have lost 70% of their turnover, they simply couldn't employ everyone for their standard hours because the work just wasn't there. And to measure how well that system worked, one piece of evidence is the fact that disputes could be sent to the Fair Work Commission. So you've had potentially up to 3.5 million employees covered by this system. There were only 667 disputes lodged with the Fair Work Commission, an absolutely tiny number of the millions of employees who would have been covered by this system. But the obvious problem that we now face is that with JobKeeper number 2 coming online, what do you do with a business who might have been down in its turnover 70% and might be recovering out and trading out of trouble, but still has a downturn but not quite up to 30%? So it might have been 70% down in its turnover, now it's 20% down in its turnover. Having them needing to also be able to direct their employees down to the number of hours of work that are actually available to allow it to trade out of problem is critical. So what we're doing is we're saying for another 6 months that flexibilities will be available in a more modest form. If you're on JobKeeper, if you're now doing better but you're not quite out of the woods, so you've got 10 to 30% down in your turnover, you can direct someone down in their hours of work to meet the work that is actually available, but subject to safeguards. You can't direct someone down beneath 60%, and importantly, the same fundamental safeguard exists. The employee, the test is the employee cannot be usefully employed for the employee's normal days or hours because of changes linked to COVID-19. And what is that going to mean? That is going to mean flexibilities continue and jobs will be saved.
The Attorney's time has concluded. I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to Australia's ageing population. Why is the government not only neglecting older Australians of today in aged care, but also neglecting older Australians of tomorrow through the reduction of more than 600,000 superannuation accounts to zero, and pensioners of today and tomorrow by freezing the pension for the first time in 23 years?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Those opposite never seem to understand that people's superannuation investments belong to them, not industry fund managers, Mr Speaker. They bristle and they resist, Mr Speaker. Every single time there may be any suggestion that those own savings, their own savings, they may wish to use them themselves, Mr Speaker,
the member for Sydney,
during a pandemic.
Prime Minister will just pause for a second. I shouldn't have to remind members every 15 minutes of what I've said about interjections. I'm not upset about it. I will just remove members. We're in different circumstances, and if they can't understand the import of that and why I'm taking this action, they'll have to figure it out back in their offices. It applies to both sides. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. One of the many measures that our government put in place to support people through this pandemic was to ensure they could get access to their own savings, their own money, in their own superannuation accounts, Mr Speaker, to ensure that they could make their way through with their own resources on top of the other resources that were being made available to the largest income supports that a government has ever put in place in this country. But those opposite think it's their money, Mr Speaker. They think it's union fund managers' money.
Members on my right.
How it's done, how many fees they have to pay, Mr Speaker. Just in this Senate, just today, Mr Speaker, your super, your choice legislation was passed. It's important legislation which understands that people's superannuation money is their money, not the Labor Party's, not the industry fund managers, not any fund manager, Mr Speaker. We believe it belongs to them because they worked for it, they earned it, they saved it, Mr Speaker, and when they need it at a time in a pandemic, we're going to make sure they can get access to it. Now, those opposite reject that. They resist this, Mr Speaker. They turn up here like puppets on a string on behalf of the union fund managers, Mr Speaker, and they trot out the lines on their behalf. but we have a message for those. It's not your money. We won't let you take it from those who've earned it, Mr Speaker, when they need it. When they need it.
The member
we'll
for
make
Sydney
it available
is
to
warned.
them, as we have made it available to them. And you know what they're doing with it, Mr Speaker? They're ensuring that they can pay down their mortgages and they can protect their homes, that they can pay independent school fees, Mr Speaker, so they can look after and pay down their debt, so they can pay their rent, Mr Speaker, so they can look after their kids. Those opposite, Mr Speaker,
Leader
want
of the
to keep
Opposition.
the hard-earned savings of Australians away from them when they need it most and have it tucked up into the industry fund, union fund managers, Mr Speaker, as they count their directors' fees, Mr Speaker.
The member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is supporting local communities located along the Great Barrier Reef as they face the economic challenges that have arisen from the COVID pandemic?
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Ryan for his question? And as a Queenslander, he knows the importance of the Great Barrier Reef and its communities to every single Australian. Whether it be Indigenous sea ranges spearing crown-of-thorns starfish, a tropical paradise where you can swim, snorkel, sail, dive, explore the ancient Daintree rainforest against an unforgettable natural marine environment. The reef is extraordinary, and it normally contributes $6.4 billion annually to the national economy and generates 64,000 jobs. We're providing much-needed relief to regional economies along the Great Barrier Reef, and we know they depend on tourism and they are facing unprecedented circumstances with COVID-19. We've acted in several key areas. We've waived permit fees for tourism businesses till June 2021. We've waived lease payments on Commonwealth-owned islands, committed funding to Reef HQ in Townsville, and I know the member for Herbert will be on my case to do more for this great natural display of marine life that provides education and jobs in his main city. And $27 million towards Reef HQ in December last year. We're building on that. Through legislation recently passed in the Parliament, tourism operators in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park do not have to remit the charge collected from visiting tourists, the so-called Environment Management Charge. And the members for Dawson and Leichhardt worked hard and helped to make this possible. Indeed, the Whitsunday Charter Boat Association described it as more of a godsend than we realise. Our fantastic reef envoy, the member for Leichhardt, can't be here today. He's with his community in North Queensland, said that combined with other economic support packages like JobKeeper, this has ensured reef tourism operators have been able to retain staff until we return to some semblance of normality. It's helped save jobs that would otherwise have been lost and provides financial relief to people who've spent a lifetime establishing world-class tourism operations. These short-term economic measures complement our ongoing commitments to the reef, which is benchmarked against global standards, our management recognised as a leading example and considered by many to be the gold standard, according to a UNESCO report. We are investing $1.9 billion in the Reef 2050 plan, and as the Treasurer has said, our economic supports, whether they be JobKeeper or what we're providing through this Relief and Recovery Fund, are all about keeping businesses viable and keeping Australians in jobs so we can come out the other side stronger and successful, and in this case showcasing this extraordinary national wonder to the world.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is it correct that the Prime Minister waited until the 25th of July to announce the Victorian Aged Care Response Centre, well after high levels of community transmission in Victoria had taken hold, after 294 Victorian aged care residents had been infected and after 26 aged care residents in Victoria had died?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Over the course of the many months since March, there were responses, as I articulated the House earlier this week, that were undertaken to put in place the plan that was pulled together in March and then refreshed on several occasions leading up to the events which the Shadow Minister has made reference to. Preparations were underway to bring together that aged care response centre, and it was established at the time that the member has raised in his question, Mr Speaker. All through this crisis, though, and indeed before that time, Mr Speaker, the engagement between the Victorian Government and the Commonwealth Government to seek to provide the response that was necessary in these centres consistent with the plan was being undertaken.
The member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government's urban infrastructure program is boosting the economy and creating thousands of jobs as we come out of the other side of coronavirus?
The minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Reid for her question. As she knows, COVID's had a devastating impact on the economy right across the country, and particularly on jobs. Hundreds of thousands of jobs lost, and even more will be lost in Victoria, as the Treasurer has outlined. And this has an enormous impact on people's individuals' lives, their livelihoods, and, as the member for Reid knows, as a trained psychologist, their mental health as well. Just one of the ways that we are supporting the COVID recovery is through a massive investment in job-creating infrastructure. As members would know, we already have a $100 billion pipeline of infrastructure projects across the country, and that even today is supporting 85,000 jobs in those projects which are already underway. And even since then, we've announced so many more projects which will get started shortly, and that will be tens of thousands of jobs more. And this will be jobs right across our great continent, Mr Speaker, including in our great capital cities. In the member for Reid's home city, for example, of Sydney, we've got some enormous projects which are underway or just about to kick off. The Western Sydney Rail, for example, which we announced just a few weeks ago, it itself will create thousands of jobs, an extra 10,000 jobs itself, 14,000 jobs. The Western Sydney Airport, of course, is supporting 10,000 jobs itself, as well as the WestConnect project, which one stage is done, the next stage is starting. That again just supports a further 10,000 jobs also. In my home state of Victoria, which has been so particularly devastated by this second wave, again we've just got huge investments going on there. The massive North East link itself, where we have a $1.75 billion investment, it will create 10,000 jobs as a standalone project itself. Before the M80 investments, the Monash investments and so many other projects which we have going on in Victoria. And then, of course, there's the North-South Corridor in Adelaide, the Metronet in Perth, there's the Bridgewater Bridge in Hobart and M1 up in Queensland. All of these other great projects supporting jobs. And these jobs aren't just supporting the individuals. Of course it does, for them to have a living, to get out of bed, to go to work each day, but it also supports local companies who are doing the work in each of these capital cities and across the country. Not just local construction companies, but it's all in the associated services as well. The cafes, all the other support services that assist in helping the tradies when they're doing that work. We have a massive program underway, 85,000 jobs already, 10,000 more. It's a critical part of our COVID recovery.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And on that note, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and I seek to add further to two answers.
Yes, the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In relation to the question raised by the member for Fraser in relation to the Kalinia Care COVID-19 outbreak, I note the following. The Kalinia Care notified the Department of Health that they had a positive case on the 27th of July 2020. The Department of Health had organised clinical first responder nurse testing, workforce support and PPE as soon as this notification occurred. The spread of the virus at Kalinia Care occurred because a COVID-positive staff member that worked in the kitchen had contact with a large number of residents prior to being diagnosed with the virus. Testing of staff and residents by Sonic commenced at Kalinia Care the day after the department was notified, and that is on the 28th of July. The Australian Government responded to each request from Kalinga Care for workforce support and provide a range of search staff from the 31st of July onwards. The majority of positive residents remain at the facility. The Australian Defence Force and leadership of the Djerriwarrh Health Services are assisting with facility management. Mr Speaker, in relation to the other, the Department of Health and Victorian Aged Care Response Centre is continuing to provide intensive support to Kalinga Care until the outbreak is resolved. However, providers of the residential aged care facilities like Ukrainian Elderly People's Home have a responsibility obviously to the residents, as I've noted in the other cases. Mr Speaker, in relation to the question raised by the member for Scullin, Epping Gardens, Heritage Epping Gardens, notified the Department of Health that they had a positive case on the 20th of July. The Department of Health organised a case manager, a clinical first responder, testing, workforce support and PPE as soon as this notification occurred. I understand that the spread of the virus at Epping Gardens occurred because a COVID-positive staff member had contact with a large number of residents prior to being diagnosed with the virus. Testing of staff and residents commenced at Epping Gardens on the same day the positive COVID-19 case was identified. That was the 19th of July. I note that media reports that the outbreak was due to a lack of testing are not correct. The Australian Government responded to each request from Epping Gardens for workforce support and provided a range of surge staff from the 21st of July onwards. While there are some residents who remain at the facility, the majority of residents at Epping Gardens have been transferred to hospital. The Department of Health and Victorian Aged Care Response Centre will continue to provide intensive support to Epping Gardens until this outbreak is resolved. Thank you, Mr Speaker.